So let's start with the historical circumstance. Let's start trying to understand how we get from where we were last week, thinking about what happened at Munich, to then the outbreak of World War II. All of this happens rather dramatically in 1939. 1939 sees a series of events, really accelerating events, that lead up to the beginning of the war on the 1st of September. In mid-March, the Germans occupied Prague. And Hungary also invaded Czechoslovakia. Slovakia itself declared its independence from Czechoslovakia, and so in effect divided itself off in the way that it's now divided. Slovakia and the Czech Republic are two different countries today. Now, why was this such a tremendous betrayal? That's exactly the way Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, saw it, and it's really what it was. Why? Because the whole idea, the previous September, of him flying to Munich in 1938 was to settle this question of Czech independence of the Sudetenland, the area of German-speaking people within Czechoslovakia, and the whole idea was Hitler promised, this will be my last territorial demand in Europe. I will no longer press for any more territory. The control of the Sudetenland was passed over to Germany. That included most of the Czech army and the Skoda works, which were a huge armament factory. It really shifted the balance of power away from the Allies, away from Britain and France, which together with Czechoslovakia were far stronger than Germany, to suddenly things going in exactly the opposite direction. Germany plus Czechoslovakia, and these arms-producing regions, were really significantly more powerful than Britain and France combined. Well, in any case, the whole idea was that Hitler was to stop there. But he didn't. He marched on Prague, which was not part of the Sudetenland, which was the heart of the Czech Republic. And Neville Chamberlain was outraged. He recognized betrayal. Remember, he had said as recently as September, just 6 months earlier, I have secured us peace for our time. Now he realizes that he has been taken. And so he stands before Parliament and says, today I share their disappointment, their indignation, that those hopes have been so wantonly shattered. There, he refers to the Czechs. How can these events this week be reconciled with those assurances which I've read out to you? Is this the last attack upon a small state, or is it to be followed by another? Is this, in fact, a step in the direction of an attempt to dominate the world by force? Now, why does he go so dramatically in that direction? Why has he been acceding to all sorts of demands, saying, oh, the Tsar, yes, take it back. Ah, yes, the Rhineland, it's fine. Send troops into it, we won't do anything. Austria, okay, you can move troops into Austria. The Sudetenland, well, okay. But finally he draws a line. Finally, the Germans march into Prague and he says, no. Now why? What was dramatically different about this?
Well, it's because Hitler had previously promised that he wouldn't infringe any further on Czechoslovakian territory. So because he had already taken over that territory and pushing for it, it was pretty much seen as a blatant act of aggression.
Okay, good. Part of it is that Hitler had promised not to do it, right? It was very specific. Hitler had said, look, if you give me control of the Sudetenland, I'll leave the rest alone. And so he had met with Chamberlain. Remember, just that afternoon, the German generals had decided to launch a coup attempt. They were going to arrest Hitler that evening. And then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Chamberlain announces that he's flying to Munich. The German generals say, okay, we'll let this play out, we'll see what happens. And then, after Hitler comes back and says, see, I told you that give me the Sudetenland, the generals are abashed. So Hitler seems to be in complete control, but it was predicated on that promise that he wouldn't go any further. And here he's directly betraying not just some treaty obligation left over from the Treaty of Versailles, but a specific promise he made to Chamberlain himself, eye to eye. And so Chamberlain at the time said, I think this is someone I can trust. Now he realizes, no, this is someone I cannot trust. So that's part of it. But there is one other element of this which has to do with Versailles. Remember that the reaction to some of these earlier things in Britain was predominantly, well, there was provocation. There was excuse. Why? Well, because people thought of the terms of the Treaty of Versailles themselves as unfair. But this is something that seems to have nothing to do with the Treaty of Versailles or anything the Germans could have been perceiving as unfair. There was no reason for Hitler to say, aha, Prague used to be part of Germany. No, it wasn't. It was never part of Germany. It was part of Austria-Hungary, but not part of the German-speaking regions at all. And so there was no justification. Even if you thought all the terms of the Treaty of Versailles were unjust. Even if you thought Hitler was in some degree justified in saying, I'm not going to obey any of the terms of that treaty, this wasn't something you could justify in terms of that. Everything else, yes, you could say, well, it's really Hitler reversing Versailles. But hey, maybe we were unfair for imposing those terms, and so maybe we really shouldn't do anything about it. Here, no such excuse. There is nothing that Hitler could say other than naked aggression that would justify this. Germany had no claim on this territory of any kind at all. And so Chamberlain recognizes the betrayal, and quickly events proceed. Within a week, the Germans have occupied a prominent city and a port in Lithuania. That too was not traditionally part of Germany. Chamberlain says, I now have to inform the House that in the event of any action which clearly threatened Polish independence, because what's in between Lithuania and Germany? Well, Poland. And so immediately Chamberlain says Poland's next. So he says, if anything threatens Polish independence, and which the Polish government accordingly considered it vital to resist with national forces, His Majesty's government would feel themselves bound at once to lend the Polish government all support in their power. They've given the Polish government an assurance to this effect. So he's basically pledged that Britain will come into a war in defense of Poland, if Germany should attack Poland. Now, events proceed. Mussolini attacks Albania. Mussolini is really not in a very strong position. He doesn't have nearly the army that Germany does. Remember, the Italian army in the First World War didn't do terribly well, but he's already beaten up on Ethiopia. Now he attacks Albania. The USSR offers a mutual assistance pact with Britain and France. Basically, Stalin wants to align himself with England, with France, become part of the Allies. And what happens? How does the British government respond? How does the French government respond? Well, you might think, I mean, what would you do? You see Hitler, overturning things, betraying you in Europe. You realize that you're on the verge of war. Russia says basically, hey, let's ally against this German guy. I mean, he's potentially a lot of trouble with us too. Let's band together. How would you respond? Okay, you might say, sure, right? We've got a common enemy. We're interested in the same thing. So you might ally, you might say, sure. You might, I suppose, look at Stalin himself and say, wait a minute, I don't want to be an ally of that government. You might say no. What did Britain and France actually do? They did nothing. Exactly, they just never responded. There is Stalin sending the equivalent of a text message saying, hey, are you there? Want to be friends? We've got to watch out for this Hitler guy. And they never answer. They never respond to these diplomatic initiatives. There is just no answer at all. Well, Stalin is baffled by this. Hitler, on April 28th, renounces a non-aggression pact with Poland. So he's like saying, Poland, remember I promised I would never attack you. Hey, all bets are off. I canceled the treaty. That's a bad sign. Molotov replaces Litvinov as foreign commissar of the USSR. Now that's actually a significant thing. Litvinov was the one who had made this overture to France and Britain. When they don't respond, not only is Litvinov baffled and appalled, but he loses Stalin's confidence. So Stalin pushes him aside and replaces him with Molotov. Now, probably you don't know much about Molotov, but he's the guy the cocktail is named after. What is a Molotov cocktail? You take gasoline, you pour it into a bottle, you put a rag on top, you light the rag, and then you throw it. It becomes a projectile that bursts into flames wherever it hits. The gasoline burns. It's a very effective and very cheap sort of weapon. In any case, Molotov is highly aggressive and completely opposed to any kind of alliance with Britain and France. So that opportunity is missed. Now, Hitler forges what he calls the Pact of Steel with Mussolini. Remember, Mussolini also had offered to become an ally of Britain and France, and they rejected it because of the war in Ethiopia. Well, at this point, Molotov gets together with the German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, and an alliance is formed between Stalin and Hitler. So it's not just that the opportunity for an alliance between France and Britain on the one hand and Russia on the other hand is missed. Russia actually allies itself with Hitler, but does so on the sly, keeps this pact a secret. And here you can see them actually signing this. There's Joseph Stalin laughing in the background. The Germans don't seem quite as happy about it, but in any case. Now, September 1st, Germany invades Poland. Hitler cooks up some crazy story that the Poles have attacked him and instead crosses over the border. Well, France and Britain the very next day declared war on But now, notice what's happened in the meantime. We've got now war between France, Germany, and Britain. Now, Poland also, but Poland falls very quickly. And now the balance of power is strongly in Germany's favor. Just a year beforehand, it would have been in favor of the Allies. Now, suddenly, they're in deep trouble. Hitler has the full power of the Czech army and the Czech munitions works, and suddenly he's in a much stronger position. Moreover, whereas Poland, it's on the other side of Germany from France and from Britain, there is actually nothing they can really do to come to Poland's defense. And they don't really make any steps. They don't do anything. Soviet troops at the same time move into eastern Poland, and so really Poland is just split between Germany and Russia. And all of that takes place within a month. By September 28th, the Soviets and the Germans have met up in mid-Poland. They've set up a treaty to say, all right, we'll agree to divide Poland along these lines. In November, the Soviets invade the Baltic states, Lithuania, the part that Germany hadn't already taken, Estonia and Latvia. They also invade Finland. There is one thing that comes out of this which is good. The Poles managed to capture an Enigma machine and get it to Britain. And that German code is quickly broken by the British. Alan Turing, one of the founders of computer science, was the British scientist who was the main person working on breaking the code. This is what the Enigma machine looked like. The Germans were convinced it was absolutely unbreakable. To us today, it looks like a rather primitive typewriter with a bunch of wires, so it doesn't look very sophisticated by contemporary cryptography standards, but at the time it was thought to be unbreakable. In any case, Churchill, in The Gathering Storm, recounts the advantages that the Allies had managed to lose. Germany had been disarmed by treaty. It rearmed in violation of that treaty, and Britain and France did nothing. Air superiority and then parity was cast away as the Germans, who were not supposed to have an air force at all, built an air force and then built one that was stronger than those of Britain or France. The Rhineland was forcibly occupied. No one did anything. The Ziegfeld defensive line was built. That sort of defensive line was prohibited under the Treaty of Versailles, but they went ahead and did it anyway. No one did anything. He established an axis between Berlin and Rome, annexed Austria, invaded Czechoslovakia, took over the munitions factories, and throughout all of this, the Allies did nothing. Moreover, both the United States and Russia offered help. They offered an alliance. Italy had offered that alliance before. Those opportunities were squandered. Well, Churchill, as you can see, unhappy about these affairs, eventually becomes prime minister. And he writes about this way. History, which we are told is mainly the record of the crimes, follies, and miseries of mankind, may be scoured and ransacked to find a parallel to the sudden and complete reversal of 5 or 6 years' policy of easygoing, placatory appeasement, and its transformation almost overnight into a readiness to accept an obviously imminent war on far worse conditions and on the greatest scale. In other words, in 1936, in 1937, 1938, Britain and France could have made the decision to go to war against Germany. And not only could they have easily defeated Germany, but actually the German generals were not at that point united behind him. They would have deposed Hitler as soon as any military action started. It would have been easy. In fact, the German generals were ready to do it in September of 1938, and if only Chamberlain had delayed his announcement by a few hours, would have cast Hitler aside and thrown him into jail. And so in the end, by September 1939, the Allies are committing to go to war in defense of Poland, which they can actually do nothing at all to defend. And now they are actually outnumbered and outgunned. The balance of power has shifted to the other side. And it is rather astounding in a way that now they go to war once everything is shifted against them. And Churchill worries about this. He says, look, doing that, delaying the war, delaying all of this, and then in the end having to fight under much more difficult situations, that didn't make any sense at all. He says, if you won't fight for the right when you can easily win without bloodshed, if you won't fight when your victory will be sure and not too costly, you may come to the moment when you will have to fight with the odds against you, and only a precarious chance of survival. And that's exactly where he thought Britain and France were in September 1939. There may even be a worse case. You may have to fight when there's no hope of victory, because it's better to perish than live as slaves. And he raises a sort of problem. We'll call it democracy's dilemma. Is this inevitable for a democracy? His idea is that a democracy is going to tend to delay fighting as long as possible. People don't want to fight. People have no desire to be involved in a war. They realize it's their lives and their treasures that are at stake. And so they're going to do their best to delay wars. In many ways, this is a good thing. This is why democracies almost never fight one another. But, he says, on the other hand, there is a danger. The reluctance of a democracy to fight can mean that they delay fighting against an inevitable adversary to the point where the balance of power is stacked against them. In short, democracies will do their best to avoid war, but when they finally are forced to confront war, they're going to do it in terms that are highly disadvantageous to them. Trotsky once said, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." And that's the kind of thing that worries Churchill. Will a democracy inevitably delay fighting until the odds are stacked against them and they have no choice? Yeah?
Isn't that like there's a possibility here, which is kind of like a false democracy, in which like give them like a bunch of resets, they will never be able to like make a decision because of almost like the thought that you won't get from democracy, so like war, peace, or do nothing, and then you'll end up doing nothing for an extended period of time.
Well, I'm very impressed that you know about Arrow's impossibility theorem. I didn't know about that until I got to graduate school. And so, I don't have time to explain it to you. But I will say the following. If you impose certain basic conditions of rationality on any system of social choice, and democracy is a good example of this, but it's not limited to this. Utilitarianism in moral theory is a good example of trying to aggregate people's desires, preferences, and interests in this sort of way. What Arrow actually proved, Kenneth Arrow, by the way, was the founder of the field of welfare economics. He was an economics professor at Harvard for many years, and his famous theorem basically says that there is actually no way to satisfy those rationality conditions outside of a dictatorship. In other words, only a dictator can actually be fully rational in approaching problems, and that's a scary thought. So you might think this is one aspect of this. A dictator can fight when it's most advantageous to the dictator, you might think, because after all, that dictator knows exactly what's going on. But in a democracy, people are not going to be able to do that. And so, I hadn't thought of that thing before, but maybe this actually is an illustration of the kind of irrationality that can emerge through democratic decision-making. Now, part of what goes on there, really, is, there's a background principle here. In Arrow, it's called the principle of the independence of irrelevant alternatives. There's a complicated series of papers about formulating it more precisely than Arrow does. But one way of explaining it in this context is to say that democracies tend to face decisions one by one. That is to say, think about what you vote on or what happens in a legislature. People choose to decide issues one-on-one. But often that's not really the way it works. There are all sorts of things outside of that that really ought to have an effect on your decision making. But it's very hard in a democracy to get people to do that. People have to vote on, this bill, up or down. It's very hard to see that whether you should vote yes on this depends on all sorts of other things you haven't decided yet. And so this can sort of be a very general problem about democracies finding it hard to reach rational decisions and to commit to rational policies, especially over the long term. Churchill thinks, look, this is something that this is a worry for democracies. It's not as if a democracy will always get itself into this trouble, but it will tend to find it very hard to sustain a rational policy about war and peace. And so he says, look, sometimes the best thing to do is to use force, even if you're not absolutely faced with a situation where you have no other choice. If the circumstances are such as to warrant it, force may be used. And if this be so, it should be used under the conditions which are most favorable. There is no merit in putting off a war for a year if when it comes it's a far worse war, or one much harder to win. But his fear is that there is something about democracies that is going to naturally lead to this result. Again, not inevitably, not always, but there will be a tendency to postpone things until there is no choice and until the democracy is fighting under worse conditions. Yeah? Yes, in a way like Kipling, yes. In a sense, civilization depends on a willingness to use violence. And Churchill is worried that democracies are too unwilling to use violence. Willing to put off that necessity for so long that finally their backs are against the wall when they do it. Imagine that someone comes into your dorm room, and at first they seem to be selling magazines. And, all right, this is annoying, you tell them to go away. But then they put their foot in the door and they don't go away. Then they walk into the room. And then they show you that in this bag, which you thought was filled with magazines, they have, nunchucks. And then they start coming in with these nunchucks flaming super outfit, right? Well, you might think, gosh, I have to do something here. And then finally you're backing up, and you're back up against the wall, and they're swinging the nunchucks closer and closer to your head. At what point do you actually decide to use physical violence against them? Well, Churchill would say, look, actually, if you view the whole situation together, right, when would you hope you would use violence? When you're, right away, right? I mean, when you would have shut the door more forcefully. They put their foot in the door and you would have stepped their foot and shut them out right then. But what happens is, finally, you're a nice person. And so here you are with your back against the wall, the nunchuck's swinging here. And you only fight when it's obvious what the person is going to do, or maybe even after you've been hit once or twice. And then you fight. And his concern is that that's what democracies tend to do. They don't really see the situation for what it is. They want to postpone the unpleasant truths as long as possible. And so, in the end, they fight, but only once they're forced to, and once they're at a great disadvantage. In any case, the war breaks out. And all of you can think about this. I don't need to really... I'm not sure who's right. There are situations where democracies have fought. You probably think of some where perhaps they shouldn't have fought. But there might be lots of other situations where democracies have postponed a conflict to the point where it became very difficult. We're going to look at some situations like that throughout the course. In any event, what happens is there's an era after the war is declared when nothing much happens directly involving Britain or France anyway. Churchill refers to this as the Twilight War. The Germans in the USSR divide Poland. Already by October, a month into the war, the Nazis have begun a program of extermination of the sick and disabled. November, USSR attacks Finland, and by January there's rationing already in the United Kingdom. Gasoline, food supplies, a variety of other goods are already rationed by the government because there are too great military needs. The Nazis bomb Scapa Flow, the main naval base of the British Navy in Scotland, by March. In April, the Nazis invade Norway and Denmark, and they take over very, very quickly. Denmark surrendered 2 days later. May, the Nazis invade the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. And so at this point, the war has become hot for Britain and France. It's no longer something that looks like a twilight war. Well, you can see here a map of Europe and see what Germany has been doing. They marched through the Low Countries. They've already taken over Czechoslovakia, half of Poland, and Austria. And so Germany at this point is starting to expand to the west. Well, also on May 10th, Churchill became the prime minister. I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. And in a gathering storm, he says, that night, my first night as prime minister, I slept soundly. I didn't need to dream. Facts are better than dreams. And he was convinced at least that now he was in charge and he understood the facts. He had not thought anybody else in the British government really understood up to that point. Well, the Netherlands surrendered almost immediately, Belgium just 2 weeks later. On June 4th, the British army was surrounded on the beach at Dunkirk, and 338,000 soldiers were evacuated. The Germans could have moved in and could have wiped out the British army. They did not. At this point, Hitler still had the idea that the English-speaking peoples, being derived of Anglo-Saxon, i.e. Germanic blood, would eventually ally with him. In any case, shortly thereafter, Norway surrendered. The Germans entered Paris on June 14th. So it took only about 5 weeks for France to fall. And indeed, France surrendered the week after that. So within 6 weeks of the German invasion, the French formally surrendered. Here you see British soldiers on the beach at Dunkirk. There was a call put out. Everyone with any kind of boat in Britain sailed for Dunkirk, and soldiers were brought back not just in naval vessels, but in pleasure boats, in fishing boats, anything that people had to evacuate the soldiers. And then in July, the Battle of Britain began. The Germans began bombing airfields and cities, factories in Britain, and bombed London on August 23rd. In retaliation, the British bombed Berlin, but were not able to do that effectively for a long time. Here you can see Big Ben behind barbed wire. Here are British soldiers moving into London at the same time families are fleeing London. Often wives and children went into the countryside to try to stay safe from the bombing attacks. In fact, if you've ever read C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, it starts with a scene like this. It's happening during the Battle of Britain when the kids flee to the countryside. They get out of London, and then all of the events take place outside of London. Here is the aerial defense system, somebody with binoculars on a rooftop. And here, you can see by now, the Nazis are in control, not just of Germany, but of the Low Countries, of Denmark, of Norway, and look at all the air bases they have now from which they can attack the United Kingdom. And so all of those lines are possible paths from German air bases in a variety of countries to Britain and to British targets. And all of those were actually used during the Battle of Britain. Here you can see the results of the bombing, with the London Bridge there in the foreground. Here is a British building and bus after a bombing attack. Firefighters trying to put out the fires. Here you see people going through a neighborhood that had been bombed out. Children sitting in front of what was their house.